Hey, welcome back. This lesson is point lights, spotlights, and skylights. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at lighting our level with different light actors. And we're also going to add materials to our level blockout. So in the previous lesson, we added in a directional light. So it's lighting our scene just very gently, but we also have these very dark shadowed areas on the walls where we don't actually have any light casting against them. Okay, we're going to take a look shortly about how we can fix this, but let's take a look at adding in different types of lights that we can use to light our level. I'm going to come over to the other side here, and I'm going to come to the light section on the modes panel, and we've taken a look at the directional light. Let's drag out a point light. So if we drag out a point light is just a simple light that gives us a radius with it and emits light within this radius. We can adjust the radius on the details panel. We can see we can make it larger and smaller. This doesn't change the brightness of the light. To change the brightness of the light, we need to adjust the intensity of it here. We can also change the light's color just by clicking this white bar here. It brings up a little color picker, so we can just click around and just drag our mouse to change the colors here. So I'm just going to give it a nice little blue tint here. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward with the point light. The spotlight is pretty straightforward as well. We can drag one of these out. So a spotlight simply just points a light in a direction, and we can see the arrow here telling us where it is. We see the light cone as well. We have the attenuation radius to change the length of the light. We can adjust the intensity, but we also have this inner cone angle and outer cone angle for this. With the outer cone angle, we can adjust this cone shape here, but this inner cone is set to 0. But if we bring this up, it adds an additional cone, and it gives us this kind of soft fall off for the light here. We can see this if we press G to hide the editor view. We can see this little soft fall off with that, and again we can change the color of these lights. Okay, we can even make the cone angle quite large, so it kind of emits onto the walls. So this is how we can use the spotlights. Moving on, we have the rectangle light we can drag out, and this is just basically used almost like a wall lamp or a TV screen if it was emitting light from a TV screen. So we don't really have any need for using this light right now in our game. So I'm going to remove this one, and we're going to move on to the skylight. Okay, we drag out the skylight. Nothing's actually happened visibly in our scene. We have different settings here. We have an intensity and light color. If we change the color, nothing's happening in our scene. If we change the intensity, nothing's happening. And if we change it between static, stationary, and movable, nothing is happening either. So what is a skylight? Well, looking at the Unreal Engine documentation, it tells us that a skylight captures the distant parts of your level and applies that to the scene as a light. So what does this mean? Well, basically, if we had a sky in our level, it would capture the light and the colors of the sky, and it would apply that as an ambient light throughout the level. Now, of course, our scene is completely dark and there's no sky at all, so this doesn't apply to us. So what else can we do to use a skylight? Well, it says here you can also manually specify a cube map to use, and we do have access to a cube map inside our project. With our skylight selected, we can change the source type on the details panel. So it's currently set to captured scene, but we don't really have much of a scene to capture to use as ambient lighting. We can drop this down and we can choose the specified cube map. And now we have access to this cube map section here. It says none, but we can click this and drop it down, and Unreal gives us a default cube map that we can use. So what does this do? Well, when we select this, we can see now that we've got an ambient light kind of just going on throughout the whole of our level. We can control the intensity of it, and look, if we set it to 0, this is what it looks like without it. Okay, so there's really dark shadows going on everywhere. But if we bring it up to, just maybe about 0.6, so this just gives us some subtle lighting in our scene. Now, of course, we can change the color of the skylight as well, just to tint it. So really, a skylight is using a captured scene to provide ambient lighting throughout our level, and we also have the ability to tint the lighting. So right now I have a challenge for you. Using the starter content materials, I want you to apply some materials onto your BSP brushes. Have a close look at the materials you're using and try to use some rocky or stone-like materials. And now that we've taken a look at the different types of light actors, I want you to light your level using these lights. So pause the video here and light your scene, and when you're ready, come back to the lesson and hit resume. So in my level, I've just used these spotlights and I've tinted them with a blue colour, and I've also used this inner cone angle and outer cone angle to kind of give us this little soft lighting look here. And I've used the cobblestone smooth material from the starter content on the floor. But the walls I purposely left empty just to remind you that we can multi-select actors by selecting one, and then I can press Control and select another actor. And now with the geometry section on the details panel, I can choose select and then select all adjacent surfaces, and I can drag and drop a material onto this. I'm just going to use the rock basalt material just here. We can take a closer look at our level by focusing the viewport and pressing F11 to toggle into full screen mode. This is also known as immersive mode. So that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to start taking a look at blueprint classes. Hey, welcome back to this lesson, which is Blueprint Actor class. In this lesson, we're going to break down what makes a blueprint actor, and then we will move on to creating our own blueprint actor that we can place in our level. So we have our level with some spotlights in it and some materials applied on our BSP brushes. So we want a way where we can represent where the player is going to start, and we can just use the player start for this from the basic tab. We can just click and drag this out into the level and plot it down. We want to make sure it's at the start of our level, and how can we do that? Well, if we select the floor, we can see that its location is at 0, 0, 0. So this is the starting area of our level. We can plot the player start anywhere around here. So let's move on to blueprint classes. Let's take a look at creating our first blueprint actor. Inside my content browser, I'm just going to right click and create a new folder, and I'm just going to name this blueprints. Okay, and we can come inside this folder, and here is where we can create our blueprint. So there's different types of blueprint classes we can create, and we're going to start with an actor. We're going to begin creating a collectible crystal. In our game, as the player moves through the level, they will be able to collect these crystals, and these crystals have very specific requirements and behaviors. Let's break these down. So the crystal needs a mesh so we can visually see it in the level. It's going to need a trigger of some sort to allow the player to collect it. We might want to add some motion to it so it spins. We could also make it bob up and down. And for a nice effect, we can make it emit light. So there's a lot going on with the individual crystal. But here's the important part. We need it to have reusability. We need to be able to easily place these crystals in our level without having to program each one individually. And so this is where blueprint classes are really powerful, because we can create a blueprint actor class for this crystal that contains everything I have just listed. And blueprint actors are reusable. We can add as many of them to our level as we want without the need of having to individually code each one. Let's break down a blueprint actor. We're going to end up with this blueprint crystal. And this is the blueprint actor, but we can think of an actor as a container. An actor contains components. So what do I mean by this? Well, here we see the final crystal blueprint, and it's made out of different components. It has some static mesh components, it has a sphere trigger component, and a point light component. All of these components are contained within the actor, but we can see that it's the components that make the actor what it is. And one of the most powerful features of these blueprint classes is that they have their own blueprint graphs. So blueprint classes can also contain code. So how do we go about creating a blueprint class? First, make sure you are in the correct folder within the content browser, And then where we see drop files here or right click to create content, we are going to right click to create content, and here we can see a blueprint class that we can create. So if we select this here, it's going to ask us what type of blueprint class we want to create. So there's many different classes to choose from, but we know that we want to create an actor class. So let's focus in on the actor for now. The actor is just here, and it says an actor is an object that can be placed or spawned in the world. So this is exactly what we need. Let's select actor, and let's just give this a name. I'm going to name mine BP underscore crystal. Okay, we can double click this actor to open it up. So inside our blueprint, this is our first look at the interface. We have this viewport in the center, and around the interface on the sides we have this components tab, we have this details tab on the right, and down in the bottom left we have this my blueprint tab. Now we're not going to be working with this my blueprint tab, so I'm just going to go ahead and close this. So we just have the components tab, we have the viewport and the details tab. So where should we start? Well, let's focus in on the viewport for now. The viewport shows us what our blueprint looks like, and it allows us to affect the transform of components that we add to our blueprint. Of course, we just created our blueprint, so it doesn't really look like much right now, but we do see this white circle in the center here. This is actually a component that gets created by default when we create a blueprint actor class. So this is the root component of the blueprint. Let's look at the components tab on the left tab here. So the components tab shows us a complete list of all the components that make up our actor, and we just have this default scene root. This is actually what the white sphere represents here. It's the default scene root, which is the root component. So what is a root component and why do we have it? Well, let's break this down. Let's say we have an actor blueprint. In our case, we have our crystal. As we've just seen, this has a root component when the actor is created. Now, an important thing to note here is that every actor that we want to place in a level or we want to exist in a level needs a root component. We know that from working with actors in the previous section that actors have a transform. We can move them around, we can rotate them, and we can scale them. But here's the important thing. The actual transform of an actor comes from its root component. So when we affect an actor's transform, such as moving an actor through the world, really we are just moving its root component. So it's the root component that gives an actor its transform. And there's another thing to be said here. In Unreal, we can add components to actors. As an example, you can add a static mesh component, you can add trigger components, and you can add light components. But when we add components to an actor, they automatically attach themselves to the root component, so they become children of the root. You can think of the root component as the parent for all the components in an actor. So when we move an actor, or when we move the root component of the actor, all the children components follow it. Now let's take a look at adding in our first component. To add in a component, we will come up to the green Add Components button on the Components tab. We'll click this, and we can see a list of all the components that we can add to an actor inside Unreal. Now we're just going to focus in on adding in the static mesh component. So let's just select this. We can see we've added it in. We can see that this little white arrow is next to the default scene root. This means that it now has a child. So the root has a child, and the child is the static mesh. Notice if we select the default scene root, we can't move it because it's the root, but we can move the static mesh because it's a child of the root. Now it's a static mesh component, but it doesn't have any mesh assigned to it. With the static mesh component selected, we can see on the details panel that it looks very similar to the details from when we work in the level. But look, we have this static mesh slot here. Remember, when we assigned materials from the content browser, we can also assign static meshes from the content browser. So to do this, we can come back to the level and the content folder, and then the starter content folder, we have the shapes, and we can assign any of these shapes here just by selecting a shape and then coming into the blueprint and hitting this little arrow on the static mesh slot. So now you know how to add static mesh components to your actor blueprint, and you know how to assign meshes to the component from the content browser. So right now I have a challenge for you. In your blueprint, I want you to create two static mesh components. And then I want you to assign a pyramid shape from the starter content to the static mesh slot on the components. And then try rotating one of the components to make a crystal. So pause the video here and give it a go, and then come back and hit resume, and I'll walk you through the process. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can do this. So I've moved my static mesh component, so it's no longer in the center of my actor, but I want it reset back to the center. So to do this, with the component selected, you can just hit this little yellow arrow on the end of the location transform, and that simply resets it back to 0 there. Okay, and now we want to assign a static mesh to this. We can drop it down here and select the mesh, or we can come back to the level and we can come to the content folder and then the starter content, and then inside the shapes folder we can choose a shape here. So we have a shape quad pyramid or a shape tri pyramid. I'm going to use the quad pyramid. I'm going to select it, come back to my blueprint, and because it's selected in the content browser, I can use this arrow here to assign it to my static mesh component. Okay, so we've got one half of this crystal working. Now let's add in another static mesh component. And because we've got that mesh selected in the content browser, Unreal is automatically going to suggest and assign that mesh to us when we add a new static mesh in. Okay, so this is pretty handy. We can just go ahead and rotate it by switching to the rotation tool, and we can rotate it 180 degrees there to give us this kind of crystal-like shape. But notice what's happened to the hierarchy here. We have the default scene root, which is the parent of the parent's component of our actor. We then have this static mesh component, and then we have this shape quad pyramid, which is also a static mesh component, which is a child of this static mesh. So it's getting a bit crazy. Let's rename these right now. I'm going to select the first static mesh and hit F2 to rename it, and I'm just going to name this crystal top half. And then the second one is going to be crystal bottom half. So the crystal bottom half is a child of the crystal top half. What does this mean if it's a child? Well, if I move the crystal top half, the child is going to stay with the parent. If I scale the parent, it's also going to scale the child there. I can also reset these back to default here to reset them back. Okay, I'm going to hit compile and save, and then come back to the level. Let's come back to where our blueprint is, and let's just drag it out into the world. Okay, so we can see it's kind of large. We might want to scale it down. We can compare the size of it by selecting the player star and seeing the capsule size. So that's pretty large. I'm going to scale this down to about, let's say about 0.4. Okay, that's looking like a good size. And we can add these as many times as we want just by dragging them out from the content browser. So we have some reusability with this blueprint that we've just created, and we can alt drag to duplicate them as well. So we're going to wrap up this lesson here now, because we can't really take this much further without our player. So in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at creating a player pawn so we can move around the world and start collecting our crystals.